Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Vanishing Hour. I am Snow here with another vanishing case for us to overanalyze like we do. But before we begin, of course, like/follow, or even both at the socials. Check out the Bare Bones Patreon page I made. I am currently working on I can't talk today already. I am currently working on new stuff to put up that will be kind of fun. Also, kind of curious on your guys' opinion on whether or not I should even attempt to make content videos for these podcasts. I always love to watch slideshows on YouTube of cases presented. It helps me kind of get a better idea of faces and places and stuff like that regarding the case. I also enjoy seeing some of the people's faces too when they talk about the cases. Not all of them, but a few of them. But I don't know, kind of thinking of making a test one and posting it to see what happens. But yeah, if you want to offer your opinion, there's a poll up on Patreon, or just leave it in the comments somewhere. I'll eventually find it. But anyway, I got a new case for us today. It's one I heard of maybe a year ago, I'd say, and I didn't really dig into it much further at that time, mainly because child cases can be difficult for me to analyze, especially younger children's cases. They kind of create this heavy, achy paranoia in my brain that has since been magnified times 1,000 after becoming a parent. Honestly, I'm surprised I can still function sometimes with the level of constant paranoia I live in as a mother. But those cases equally deserve to be covered, and I am working on covering them more. I do believe this case has been looked over by the media pretty extensively, at least back in 1999, which is when it happened. And it's not that old of a case either, but there's a lot to it, and there does seem to be this eerie vibe to it that I look for when I'm researching cases. A lot of cases oftentimes have a pretty clear-cut outline or idea of what happened, and it's just a matter of the physical evidence needed to prove it. But I like to gravitate more towards cases that have that, what I like to call an X factor. You know what I'm talking about? That little morsel of complete mindfuckery or confusion or terror, or just complete inexplicability. Those are what really get my brain cranking and pondering and rabbit holing. And this case had that for me, so we are going to cover it today. This, my listener friends, is the vanishing of Mikelle Biggs. So Mikelle was born May 31st, 1989 to parents Tracy and Darren Biggs. She was the oldest of 4 children that the Biggs had. Mikelle, at the time of her disappearance, was 11 years old. She was a 6th grade honors student at the Lindbergh Elementary School and had big dreams of becoming a Disney sketch artist when she grew up. She was described as the neat freak of the family, according to her younger sister Kimber, who was a mere 2 years younger than her. They shared a bedroom together, and despite normal sister bickering, they were close and did everything together. Mikelle was also the protective sibling of her youngest siblings, Nathan and Linnell, and made sure to include them in games and activities that they would all play together. Darren was the breadwinner for the family, while Tracy was a stay-at-home mom with the kids. They were active members of the Latter-day Saints church community, and their street that they lived on mainly consisted of their church family as well, and in many ways felt like an extension of their home. Most moms on the street were totally comfortable with letting their kids play outside until the street lights came on and it was time for dinner. I remember growing up like this. I remember the streetlight rule, and I remember what it felt like to be a kid outside playing the whole day and feeling completely safe. Now, being the oldest, Mikelle was well versed in the importance of stranger danger and being smart and safe and never talking to people she didn't know. She was smart, very bright, and a friendly kid who loved her life and loved her family, which made the events on January 2nd, 1999 all the more hard to accept and really just fucking shocking, if I'm being honest. Now, January 2nd, 1999 started out like any other day. Darren left for work. Tracy and the kids were at home. Most of Mesa, Arizona was recovering from a busy holiday season, and we're all nestling in for the day to watch the Cardinals play against the Cowboys. Mikelle and Kimber decided to spend the afternoon playing outside with Kimber's brand spanking new pink and purple bike that she received for Christmas just a few days prior. The girls were outside having a blast, and sometime a little after 5:30 p.m., the girls heard a familiar sound in the distance. The music of the ice cream man may be a few blocks over at the most. Like every other kid that age, the girls ran back home and begged their mom for some money to buy an ice cream from the ice cream man. Tracy handed a few quarters over to Mikelle, and the girls booked it back down the street. Now, the Biggs' house was located on, for lack of a better term, shaft of a T-shaped street. Their house was 4 plots away from the T intersection that the girls stood at to wait for the ice cream man. This was a completely residential area. Everything was surrounded by a home. There wasn't any like corner store or school or park or like a main street. It was a complete tract home neighborhood. Anyway, so the girls stood at the corner. I believe it was El Moro and Toltec, right on the corner of that street, waiting for the sound of the distant music to gradually get closer and louder until they saw the ice cream man. However, that didn't seem to happen. One account stated that there were several other children that waited and eventually gave up. Again, this was only one account. But if it's true, all of these children apparently had heard the music as well, but never saw the ice cream man, which for some fucking reason completely creeps me out. I know it's completely possible that the ice cream man himself was just stagnant for a while, but when I first heard that the music never got louder, all I could picture was like some creepy fuck in a beat up station wagon playing ice cream man truck music faintly to draw out children. Highly unlikely, but I couldn't shake that mental image. I'm telling you guys, it's paranoia. Anyway, so Kimber says that after about roughly 10 minutes of waiting, she started to get cold and wanted to head back in. Mikelle, on the other hand, was still doing circles on the bike and wanted to wait a little longer. Arizona is a desert, so it's hot as long as the sun's out, but once the sun starts to set, temperatures drop fast. Kimber wasn't about to stand out there any longer, so she turned around and headed back the 4 houses down the street. When she got back into her house, she told her mom that the ice cream man hadn't come and that Mikelle was still waiting outside. Tracy told her to go get her sister and tell her to come back in for dinner. Kimber huffed, turned on her heel, and stormed back out of the house and yelled down the street for Mikelle to come back home. The only thing was, Mikelle wasn't there anymore. She wasn't making the circles at the end of the street that she had just been making not more than 2 minutes ago when her sister was standing right beside her. Her sister squinted down the street and saw something laying on the side of the road. She couldn't make out what it was, so she started heading closer. As she got closer, she instantly recognized the item as being her brand new bike. It was just laying on its side in the street with the back wheel still spinning. Initially, Kimber said she felt a tinge of anger at her sister for being so careless with her new bike. But almost as quickly as that feeling arrived, it dissipated and turned into this sort of numbing, ominous terror. She said she stood there briefly and wasn't quite sure what she was feeling, but that it felt wrong and unsettling. She turned around and headed back to her house. She came into the kitchen and told Tracy that Mikelle wasn't out there. One account said that Tracy told Kimber to head to a neighbor of theirs that Mikelle was known to hang out at and see if she was there. Kimber apparently did so, and the family stated that they hadn't seen her and they were all seated around the table about to eat dinner. They sent their son with Kimber to scout the neighborhood to find Mikelle. Kimber took him to the spot where the bike was, and that's when the boy spotted Mikelle's quarters from her mother strewn on the pavement nearby. That was when he turned to Kimber and sternly told her to go immediately home and tell her mom that Mikelle was gone. Another account, however, said that when Kimber returned to the street and saw her abandoned bike there, she grabbed it and brought it back. She told her mom, at which point her mom and her headed out to the street and saw the quarters and immediately returned home and called the police. Either way, the bike was abandoned in such a way that it immediately set off alarms to those that found it, and they alerted police. At this time, Tracy paged Darren, who at the time was supposed to be at work, and told him that Mikelle was missing. He left and headed home when he received the message. When police arrived at the scene, they analyzed what they had. They talked to Kimber and had her retrace her steps and try to recall anything she may have seen during that period. She repeated that they heard the ice cream man in the distance, headed to the corner to flag him down. When he didn't turn up, Kimber returned home while Mikelle waited. She wasn't gone for more than 90 seconds when she returned to see her bike on its side, wheels still spinning, and her sister's money on the ground. The bike and money were found closer to the home rather than at the corner where Mikelle was last seen, leading detectives to believe that Mikelle was heading in the direction of home when she vanished, either because she gave up and was heading back to, or she was attempting to get away from someone. It seems the police believe that it was the latter, but it's always bothered me that nobody heard or saw anything. In that close-knit of a neighborhood, if an 11-year-old was pedaling as fast as she could to get away from something or someone that she was aware of and scared of, I feel like there would have been noise. Either her screaming or kicking, the sound of a car peeling out of there. I feel like there would have been more signs of a struggle. I know she's little, but if you think about it, the perp had to have waited until Kimber was out of at least earshot, let alone line of sight, to at least begin pursuit, which shaves off, 20 seconds of time from her getting from the corner to her house. Maybe another 30 to 45 seconds in the house before the other 20 seconds back to the corner. Their best chance of snatching Mikelle would have been the 30 to 45 second window of Kimber inside her home. That means if this was Mikelle fleeing, she had a good 10 to 15 seconds of pedaling towards her house before she was grabbed. So why was there no scream? It just doesn't make any sense. She was so close to home. I know she would have screamed if there was a danger she was aware of and was fleeing from. That kind of tells me she was snatched by surprise. She must have turned and headed back towards the house, and not even 10 seconds into that, someone must have caught her by surprise, hand over mouth, something, and she was gone. To me, nothing else makes logical sense to my brain. I do believe that the bike was left first, and then the quarters not far from it, again telling the police the direction, so I guess maybe it helped feed the theory, but I don't see a child getting off of a bike to escape a threat. You stay on, wouldn't you? It's faster. I feel like even a child knows that. Maybe depending how far exactly the quarters were from the bike, they could have been thrown from her hand in the attack. I don't know. It's just too hard to say without there being more detail on the case or being there and seeing it for yourself. But again, my point is, no scream is very weird to me. It's not impossible, but it is weird. It stands out to me. Now, luckily, police immediately handled this case as an abduction and not a runaway situation you so often see. Because of this, they immediately started taking the necessary actions in an abduction case. They immediately roped off the entire street and started canvassing for clues and interviewing neighbors and residents. They brought in bloodhounds to track her scent. You know me, I love a good bloodhound. The dogs, however, were only able to track her scent from the bike to maybe a few feet away before it completely vanished. This obviously told investigators that Mikelle was more than likely placed into a vehicle that took her away from the scene. They continued to process the scene well into the early morning hours of January 3rd. The next morning, Mikelle's abduction had spread like a wildfire to most of Mesa, and hundreds showed up in support of locating her. Many included members of their church. Volunteers and police alike passed out flyers, hung them on every post they could, and searched every nearby canal, alleyway, trash can, dumpster, shed, backyard, and orange grove within a 45-mile radius. Police at this time were setting up 6 separate roadblocks within the neighborhood where they stopped and questioned every vehicle that was entering and leaving the area. Police also went door to door to every registered sex offender in the area, which I believe at the time was somewhere in the ballpark of like 18 to 20, all of which had an alibi and account of their actions during the time of Mikelle's disappearance. So police decided to look at the situation from a different perspective. They remembered Kimber saying that her and her sister both heard the faint music of the ice cream truck in the distance. I gathered that at least a few other children in the area claimed to have heard the same thing. However, no one could say that they ever saw the ice cream truck. So police looked into every single ice cream vendor in Mesa that could have been in the vicinity. However, none of them claimed to have any trucks in Mikelle's neighborhood that Saturday evening. None of them. So police started to speculate that maybe what was heard in the distance wasn't in fact an ice cream truck that day. Now, I know that is completely possible, but it really does rub me very wrong to hear that. An ice cream truck song is so distinct, and any kid anywhere that grew up with them can tell you what they sound like. To me, there isn't anything similar to it either, except maybe like circus music or carnival music. But it doesn't sound like either of those things were in the area that day. It's also possible maybe the music was coming from a TV somewhere in the distance. But if that's true, that multiple children throughout the neighborhood heard the same thing, wouldn't it have been at varying sound levels for all of them? At wherever the point of origin was coming from, I feel like someone would have eventually said something when canvassing happened. They would have been like, oh yeah, I heard that shit on my street. Or I heard it in the distance. Or my neighbor was blasting creepy carnival music. Like, for no one to corroborate the ice cream truck music when they canvassed the entire neighborhood is weird. It leads me back to that creepy image of a crusty pervert in his beat-up station wagon playing ice cream truck music to lure kids out onto the street. Again, I know that might be a stretch for some, but that's something that is just stuck in my brain for some reason. But it does baffle me that both Kimber and Mikelle heard the music, but no one else in the area except for maybe these children, maybe not, I don't know, could confirm hearing it either. It had to have an origin, and there had to be people close enough to it to be able to recall hearing it, in my opinion. It's just incredibly creepy. But anyway, so at this point, police had spoken to just about every resident in the area at least once. Pretty much all of them had had the same recount. No one saw or heard anything out of the ordinary that evening. However, a couple people did step forward and claim to see a copper-colored Jeep in the area, leaving right around the time Mikelle went missing. Nobody recognized the vehicle as a residential one, so it stood out. Police used this information and released it to the media, who were already dying for answers or ways to help. This lead generated about 300 tips for them, and they had to investigate each and every single one. One particular one, though, stood out to police for a very eerie reason. This caller claimed to have seen that same copper-colored Jeep pulled over on the side of the road out in the desert just northeast of Mesa. Police felt that this was a solid potential lead, so they sent over 100 deputies out to the surrounding area of where this Jeep was reported to be seen. They spent a full 24 hours going over that area with a fine-tooth comb. However, they were unable to find anything that pertained to Mikelle or her whereabouts. That didn't drop the copper Jeep for the police, though. They searched the town for this Jeep before finally locating it and the owner. How they know they got the right one, I don't know, but I am curious. But apparently they tracked them down and questioned them, and whatever information they had received from them was sufficient enough to clear them from any suspicion in the case. Days after Mikelle goes missing, her community holds a vigil for her. The event is televised, with Tracy and Darren pleading for anyone with anything to speak up and say something. The news is there broadcasting the event, and neighbors can be seen with signs and posters, candles, all hoping and praying for Mikelle's safe return. News footage catches one neighborhood fellow telling cameras, quote,
"If you're my neighbor and I see that you're living next to me and I see something suspicious going on, I guarantee you I'll be calling 911.
End quote. Police take this opportunity to survey the crowd for any potential suspects or suspicious behavior. We all know that many perpetrators like to remain close to the investigation as a way of either keeping tabs on it or to relive their so-called thrill. Detectives hoped to come up with something, but it didn't appear to draw any leads. Everything seemed to be normal and nothing stood out at this vigil. Being at a kind of loss here so early on in the investigation, police turned to the family for clues or answers or something to point them in the right direction. And they find that something seems to be amiss there. Initially, the day Mikelle went missing, police arrived at the Biggs' residence and spoke with Darren and Tracy. Darren told police that he had been at work when he received the page from his wife that Mikelle was missing, at which point he left and rushed home to help search for her. When the police got around to checking his alibi a few days after, they found that Darren had not been at work when he claimed to receive the page. His fellow co-workers stated that he had been there earlier that day, but had left at about 2 p.m. When police found this alarming discrepancy, they called Darren into the station to speak with him further. Police were severely disturbed by the fact that Mikelle's own father was lying about his whereabouts the day she went missing. So the fact that Mikelle's own father was lying about his whereabouts the day she went missing, Mesa PD and the FBI alike asked him to submit to a polygraph examination. The results further confirmed that Darren was being less than truthful with them. They again confronted him with the results of the polygraph and the evidence that stated he was not at work during the time of the disappearance, and Darren lost it. He started throwing shit around the interrogation room, flipping tables, yelling and cussing out the FBI before finally storming out of the station. At this point, police are like, okay, what the fuck is up with this dude? If he didn't have anything to do with his daughter's disappearance, why is he lying to us? The media, of course, gets hold of this, and of course they run with it. Reports are going out about how Mikelle's father has failed numerous tests and is acting violently against authorities. His family has seen him become what Kimber described as a, quote, angry zombie, just like barely functioning and purely off of rage and anger is what keeping him going. All of this eventually reaches a boiling point, though. Darren eventually heads into the police station one day and sits down with a detective on the case and just spills his guts out on the table for him. He finally explains why he's been lying. A month prior to Mikelle going missing, Darren admitted to his wife that he was having an affair. Being that the two were still together when Mikelle went missing, I'd assume that they talked things out and agreed to continue their marriage and pushed past this bump in the road. However, on the day she went missing, Darren admits that he left work to go be with an unidentified woman living in Chandler, Arizona. Being that he was hiding it, I'd assume his wife had no idea. Chandler was only a 20-minute drive straight south of Mesa. He expresses to the officers that he does not want to disclose this information at that time, but he does give them the woman's name. They call her and ask her to come in for an interview. She states that Darren was with her for most of the evening. However, he left at about 5:45, just before Mikelle went missing. She states that it was because he went to get some burgers for them to eat. He leaves and returns shortly after, and that is when his pager goes off about Mikelle missing. She actually witnesses the pager going off. When asked more about her relationship with Darren, she reveals that Darren had been bringing Mikelle and the kids to her house to meet and play with her kids, and that Mikelle had expressed that she wasn't happy about this at all. I mean, just what a shitty situation to be in. Obviously, outside looking in, I don't have any idea what was going on in the Biggs' marriage. Absolutely none. If this was something that he and his wife worked out, then that's one thing. Fine, sure. But to put your own child into a situation like that upsets her is just shitty to me. I can remember being this age and finding out that my dad was dating someone else, and it pretty much destroyed me. Not to get all personal and shit here, but I can remember calling my grandparents' house one night to talk to my dad. My parents had been separated since I was like 2, but my dad would show up on occasion to do dad stuff with my sister and I always thought that there was a hope of them getting back together. Anyway, I called, and my stern, emotionless, cowboy hat-toting Western grandpa answered the phone. I asked if my dad was there, and he let it slip that my dad was out with his girlfriend. I remember screaming, "What?" And my poor grandpa immediately fumbled all over the place, and my grandma could be heard yelling, "Jam!" in the background before I hung up the phone. 20 years later, and having since had to look my own kids in the eye and tell them that mom and dad are splitting up, I can look at that situation as an adult, and I can't fault any of the adults involved for making the decisions that they made. My parents chose to keep the truth from me because it was too hard for them to explain to a 10-year-old at the time why her parents couldn't just work it out. My grandpa was just being honest, which I loved him dearly for until the day he passed away. But I think what parents or adults in these types of situations tend to forget is that you're raising children to become hopefully at least semi-functioning adults. Teaching them that you think they are too weak to handle the truth, in fact, gets them thinking that they are too weak to handle the truth. When in reality, it helps them find a way to handle the truth, because we all know it only gets harder from the day we are born. So my question is, why lie? I'm not saying sugarcoat everything, but be my grandpa. Be honest. Fumble after if need be, but then talk to them about it. And most importantly, care about how those decisions you make affect your child and how they make them feel. Sorry, this is so way off topic. It just threw me into a fucking memory I had buried for all of eternity, and now I can't stop talking about it. But yeah, I'm not saying fuck Darren for being human. By all accounts, it sounds like he was a great dad to his kids. Maybe a shit husband, but a great dad. But I am saying, hey, maybe you should have laid off the whole, hey kids, meet my mistress's kids and play with them and enjoy it, damn it, when it clearly was impacting your daughter so negatively. Anyway, this concludes my parenting seminar. Let's continue on with the case. So police are talking to the girlfriend. She says that Mikelle just wasn't liking the situation and made it very clear. She told Darren she didn't think that Mikelle was going to warm up to this idea, and that Darren's response was, quote, "Don't worry about Mikelle. I'll take care of Mikelle." End quote. Obviously, this can be taken a number of ways, but apparently to police, this sounded rotten as fuck, so they were like, bingo. Let's try and see if we can get any sort of confession out of him. So they set up camp at Darren's girlfriend's house. They coach her on what to say and have her call him. She tells him that if he did anything to Mikelle, that he needs to fess up, and whatever it is, they can work it out. This immediately pisses Darren off. He's thinking, are you fucking kidding me? He hangs up the phone and storms out of the house and gets into his car and peels out of the driveway. Police had been sitting on his house, so they followed in pursuit of him to see where he was going. He was flying down roads, blowing through the red lights, driving erratically, trying essentially to shake the tail he had. This further fed their suspicions of Darren. On the one hand, you have one parent who is fully cooperating, has told nothing but the truth, and is understanding that the police are just doing their job. Then you have Darren, that has been found lying about his alibi, seems to have an extreme anger issue, and is now evading police. Police aren't about to let up on him in any way. Their strategy is that if he is indeed guilty of involvement, he is going to have to crack under the immense pressure they are applying to him. So they continue to push him. They interrogate him, they question his timeline. They get to the point where they decide to actually test out his timeline to see if it is in fact a functional and plausible one. Darren said he left his girlfriend's house at about 5:45 p.m. So police felt they were going to reenact this and see if there was any discrepancies. So they started at the girlfriend's house. They drove to where Mikelle was abducted. They then drove to the fast food restaurant that Darren picked up burgers from, and then drove back to the girlfriend's house. While, if driven extremely fast, it was doable. However, the police felt it probably wasn't likely. The major issue was that it didn't allow enough time for him to abduct Mikelle, dispose of the body because, again, it wasn't found in his car, get the food, and then return to the house in time. Even if he tossed her out somewhere quickly in passing, it would have been a pretty public area and she would have been found rather quickly. So, armed with the functioning timeline Darren did have and the fact that the scene read more to the investigators as a stranger abduction than a close relative abduction, being that if it were her dad, why would she ditch her bike and throw the money? She was literally steps from the house. Police decided to rule out Darren as a suspect officially. I will also mention that throughout the entire investigation into him, despite how angry and crazy and at times rude and even threatening Darren was to the police, he never once refused to cooperate and he never lawyered up either. So there's that. So with the father lead crossed off the list, police had to begin looking elsewhere. They were still receiving numerous tips at the time, many of which were just not turning into anything. One was an email actually sent to, I believe, Darren himself, that was essentially a claim for ransom in exchange for Mikelle. The email stated that the person had abducted her and was holding her for X amount of money and, wire it to me and you'll get your daughter. Obviously, he turned this over to investigators, and being that even the FBI were working this case, they were able to track the IP address of where the email was sent from. It came from a local residence in Phoenix, roughly 20 miles west of Mesa. With armed police and SWAT, they closed in on the location, busted down the door, only to be greeted by a 12-year-old kid playing a fucking stupid hoax, interfering with an investigation and wasting time. I swear, if that was my child, I would have whooped his ass so hard. I don't understand how this is funny at any age. What a little shithead. Anyway, another false lead that came in was on January 9th when police were alerted to what looked to be a very freshly dug up grave just outside of Mesa. They sent police out to investigate and found nothing there. Every neighbor in Mikelle's neighborhood submitted to property searches except one. This one person chose not to comply, however, was ruled out as a suspect. Many of those who did submit said that they only did so because it was for the sake of a missing child. I'm guessing that one guy was not touched by the thought of helping in a missing children's case, but whatever, he was apparently ruled out as well somehow. So roughly 2 months later, on March 10th, 1999, something odd happened. A report came in that an unidentified male or males had attempted to abduct both a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old girl from a schoolyard. I'm assuming nearby Mesa, a location wasn't given. Police initially thought that the case might be connected to Mikelle, so they immediately started working the case. They had police sketch artists come in and were able to get 2 separate drawings of the suspects made out. One sketch appeared to be of a man maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, with lighter shoulder-length hair and some scruffy beard shit going on. Second was of an older man, maybe early to mid-40s, with darker hair, a receded hairline, and just a touch of a 5 o'clock shadow goatee thing going on. The images were released to the public, and police made it known that they thought these men could have been associated with Mikelle's abduction. However, this lead came to an abrupt end when I read one simple sentence. That sentence was, quote, "Police thought that the incident might have been connected to Mikelle's case, but the, quote, abduction was revealed to be a hoax." However, the sketches were still released to the public. They were not highly publicized as pertaining to Mikelle's case, mainly because the police were just not sure if the sketches were related to her case or not. I wish I could have found more regarding why and how the police came to the conclusion that attempted abductions were a hoax, yet still released the suspect sketches. To me, that makes no sense, but I just couldn't find anything further that clarified the subject. Police also followed up on a tip that came in that maybe Mikelle was a victim of hit and run and that the perp took her to hide the crime for fear of repercussions. Police on the surface said it may be plausible. However, there would have been way more physical evidence on the scene to support that theory. A hit and run usually involves loud sounds, for one, that maybe people would have heard. A scream in pain, squealing of tires if they had attempted to brake, or, potential blood or damage on the bike, a missing shoe, broken taillight fragments. Something to indicate impact had been at that scene, and that simply just wasn't there. Police continued on following every lead or tip they received, no matter how big or small, for close to a year, and with nothing turning up and no answers, they started to worry that this case was going to go cold and that they wouldn't find Mikelle or answers for her family. That was until the neighborhood was once again T-boned by a shocking crime. Suzanne Quinnett was a neighbor residing on a street roughly 1,000 feet away from where Mikelle went missing. She lived at home with her daughter. Susan lived a fairly normal life, and she was a part of the community that was desperately wanting answers for Mikelle's family. She, however, lately had her hands full with an unruly neighbor of hers by the name of Dee Blaylock. Dee Blaylock was a big, burly-looking son of a bitch who lived next door to Susan with his timid wife. They didn't appear to have any kids, it was just the two of them. Despite having a wife at home, though, Dee seemed to be feeding an obsession he had with Susan as of late. Susan found herself to be constantly harassed and shooting down advances of Blaylock's, and it was on a more regular basis. She filed numerous complaints with the police every time she found the guy approaching her drunk and inappropriate, and she had pretty much had it with this shit. Nothing was being done, and the police weren't looking into the issues she was having with Blaylock. One evening, however, while Susan's daughter was spending the night over at her father's house, Susan returned to her home after a day out. She walked into her kitchen and found Blaylock hiding behind her refrigerator with his pants unzipped and his schlong hanging out. Completely caught off guard by his presence, Susan asked him what the fuck he was doing in her house when he suddenly lunged at her. He grabbed her by the arm and forced her to the ground, where he brutally sexually assaulted the poor woman and then proceeded to beat the living daylights out of her. She recalls him attempting to break her neck at least 3 times and was eventually successful at fracturing it in one place. He put her in a chokehold until she passed out. He beat her face in with steel-toed boots to the point that one investigator later said it was the worst beating he had ever seen in his career. Afterwards, Susan laid there lifeless, and Blaylock assumed she was dead. He apparently attempted to set the house on fire by setting a pizza box on a lit burner on her stove before fleeing the scene. Luckily, a nearby neighbor saw smoke coming out of one of the windows and called 911. When responders arrived at the scene, they found Susan still alive and immediately rushed her to the hospital. Susan says that on the way to the hospital, she had like a come to Jesus epiphany in the back of that ambulance that Blaylock had something to do with Mikelle's disappearance. She says it was something she just felt in her bones at that moment. I believe she relays this epiphany to both the police and Mikelle's mother, Tracy. Now, Blaylock had been on police's radar almost immediately when the investigation had started. Remember that list that they compiled of all registered sex offenders in the area? Well, while Blaylock wasn't a registered offender for that area, he had prior convictions in 3 other states for crimes including sexual assault, kidnapping, and child molestation. The law apparently at the time didn't require him to register in that area or something like that. My only guess is that because they were in other states, the registry for Arizona didn't apply to him at that time. Anyway, literally nobody was aware of Blaylock's dangerous and disgusting past whatsoever, not even Susan herself. Everyone in the neighborhood knew of Blaylock as like the local handyman, lawn keeper. He like would mow lawns and cut grass for people and shit like that. He was kind of scruffy, he liked to drink and cause occasional nuisances, but nothing of the magnitude that he was actually capable of. Remember that vigil held for Mikelle, where I said media coverage caught a neighbor yelling out,
If you're my neighbor and I see that you're living next to me and I see something suspicious going on, I guarantee you, I'll be calling 911.
Yeah, that asshole was Blaylock, pretending to be a model neighbor citizen, fighting for justice and shit. Police originally spoke to Blaylock early on in the investigation, being that he did have a criminal record and was living literally 1,000 feet away from where Mikelle went missing. 1,000 feet, guys. Like down the street, like a lightning bolt shape down the street. I looked it up on Google Maps because I'm a psychopath. Anyway, the reason Blaylock had not continued to be a person of interest from the get-go was because he, along with many others in the area at the time, had an alibi. He was at home with his wife watching the Cardinals versus the Cowboys game during the time that Mikelle went missing. Being that his wife corroborated his story, the police didn't press it any further, and after a property inspection that night, he wasn't looked at seriously any further. Until now. Susan's brutal beating brought life into the case for detectives. They began going over Blaylock once more, and they began to find some seriously alarming facts. For one, When DNA evidence and Susan's recount of who attacked her got Blaylock arrested, charged, and sentenced to almost 200 years in prison, his wife was no longer under the oppression of Blaylock anymore, and she had a few things to speak to police about. Blaylock's wife recanted her original alibi for Blaylock, stating that the day Mikelle went missing, while Blaylock was originally home in their garage, she had brought him sandwiches and was told to, quote, stay away from the remainder of the evening. And that was at about 5:30-ish. She could not physically confirm where he was after that encounter. We know Mikelle went missing shortly before 6 p.m. His house is again 1,000 feet away from her. She tells police that she doesn't physically see Blaylock again until around 9:30 p.m., when she and other neighbors all head outside to see what is going on with all the helicopters and searchlights and commotion going on. That leaves 4 hours of time where no one saw or heard from Blaylock. It is also completely possible that Blaylock knew of Mikelle. She attended piano lessons just across the street from his house, and he lived just a few doors down from her best friend's house. Now, even more interestingly, the night of the disappearance, about 4 hours after she was reported missing, police actually did knock on Blaylock's door and question him. Again, this was about 10 p.m. according to the timeline, and only maybe 30 minutes after his wife sees him again since before the disappearance. They give their alibis, and Blaylock even lets them search his home, garage, and yard. Obviously, the police found nothing. Blaylock owned a storage unit that was not reported to police in the initial interview, though, that night. That was located a mere block away from their home, separate from their property, of course. That unit, which would be something similar to like a public storage unit, was about 1,000 feet away from his house in the opposite direction of where Mikelle was last seen. So altogether, from Mikelle's last known location, Blaylock's house, and the storage unit, they're all within under half a mile of each other. 2,000 feet altogether. That's literally no time at all to travel between all three places. The unit was eventually discovered and searched a few days after the disappearance when they found out of its existence, but nothing was found in the unit pertaining to Mikelle at the time. Now, obviously, given the new circumstances, police returned to the unit, now almost 2 years later, hoping to find any sign of Mikelle. This time they are armed with an extensive forensic team. They test everything in hopes of finding any sign of Mikelle or something that can point them in the direction they need to go, but they come up empty. Again, it had been almost 2 years by this point, and that allowed plenty of time for Blaylock to potentially rid the unit of any potential evidence it may have had. Regardless of the lack of evidence pertaining to Mikelle's case, Blaylock is charged with the attack on Susan. Susan, however, shocks everyone when she offers to drop the charges against Blaylock if he can admit to any involvement he had in Mikelle's abduction. It is apparently her way of bargaining with him to get some answers for the family. Police state that despite the gesture, it is not something Susan can do at this point, being that the case is now a state versus Blaylock scenario. And they can only offer a deal like that, which they are not going to. Blaylock insists on his innocence regarding not only Mikelle's disappearance, but on the day of sentencing after being found guilty, insists on his innocence in the attack on Susan as well. Zero remorse or even acknowledgement for what he did. Now, sadly for Susan, it doesn't seem like things got any better for her. 10 years after the attack on her, she finds herself on the opposite end of the law when she is found guilty of second-degree murder of her then-boyfriend after she took a wild amount of prescription antidepressants and some other shit and decided to shoot him in the head after he, quote, pushed her to her emotional breaking point. She initially lied and said she heard a pop from the other room and found him that way, but later caved during a second interview. She, too, is currently serving her sentence for this crime. Tracy and Darren continued searching for Mikelle and hoped for justice, but they both couldn't shake the feeling that they knew the man that took their daughter, and while he was behind bars, they still didn't know what had happened to her or where she was. They proceeded to write Blaylock countless letters asking, pleading, and begging for answers. It seems that there were different accounts of Blaylock's actions after his arrest as to his involvement in the case. Some sources state that he maintained his innocence, while others claim that he did provide a jailhouse confession but later redacted it. However, After I think about a year of receiving letters from Mikelle's family, he wrote them back at some point stating that he was wanting to get some things off of his chest and invited them in for a sit down. Mikelle's parents were completely shocked. They felt that they were finally going to get the answers that they had been spending years praying and searching for. When they arrived at the jail, though, they were met with disappointment and disgust. Blaylock essentially spent the entire visit denying any involvement repeatedly. He would get angry and express rage. However, a lot of it felt staged and fake. But he never once attempted to get up and leave the meeting. But he denied any involvement continuously. Darren was eventually overcome with anger and pretty much ripped the guy's head off verbally, at which point Blaylock decided to end the meeting there. When Darren and Tracy left, they asked each other how they felt that went and what their opinion was of him. Both felt that they had looked into the eyes of the man that killed their daughter. They felt he had lied at least 30 to 35 times during that entire conversation, and that he basically wasn't able to admit jack shit that he had done and was a pathological lying piece of shit. Now, despite all the circumstantial evidence against Blaylock and the suspicions swirling around him, he has never formally been charged with or even officially named as a suspect in Mikelle's disappearance. The case remained open and active even after his arrest. In 2018, though, Mikelle's case was thrown back into the spotlight when a dollar bill from a small town in Wisconsin was reported to police. The dollar bill had alleged childlike writing along its border in ink that read, quote, "My name is Mikelle Biggs." Mikelle was spelled wrong, by the way. "Kidnapped from Mesa, Arizona. I'm alive." While the lead sparked renewed hope and attention to the case, police were immediately suspicious of the note. Being that her first name was spelled wrong, that in itself was odd. She was 11 at the time she went missing, an age more than capable of spelling one's name properly. Police also thought that if she was alive and well and was handling money for that matter, why did she not contact authorities? It's possible that the dollar was written on long ago and she wasn't able to, but she didn't have any money on her when she went missing. So how did she get the money out in the open without her captor seeing it? Police more than likely thought it to be another sick asshat trying to insert themselves into something for attention and to be a piece of shit. They eventually had the handwriting tested, and it was found to not be a match. As of today, the original detectives have since retired. New detectives have vowed to continue to work this case until it is solved. Tracy and Darren have since divorced. Darren has remarried, and I believe both have moved out of state. Kimber is now the spearhead of her sister's investigation. Now a mother of her own, she vows to continue to seek justice for her sister and have her memory continue on through her kids. Now, as far as theories go, people are either in agreement that it was Blaylock or they aren't. I myself can't deny the fact that the circumstantial evidence is stacked against Blaylock. He had the means, being that he only lived feet away from where she was last seen. He had a history of abducting and molesting children. He has no alibi for the time that she went missing either. I think it is very well possible that he committed this crime. What concerns me is that there is, to this day, no physical evidence found. There are no witnesses to the abduction, which is just fucking insane to me. How is that even possible that no one saw or heard anything? Every inch of that neighborhood was covered in a home. There were no open fields, no corner stores, or even a main drag that was easily accessible. In my opinion, someone had to have a general concept, at minimum, of how to enter and exit that neighborhood unnoticed and with ease. So for me, if it wasn't Blaylock, it had to be somebody who was familiar with the area. For me, in my personal experience, visiting tract neighborhoods is always difficult because every house looks almost the exact same as the last. There's side streets that lead to more streets, and eventually you find a main street that leads out, but it's not without a little driving around. I don't believe it was just a random to the neighborhood that passed by here and saw an opportunity. I also believe that the ice cream truck lead is crucial to solving this. I don't think it's enough to just ask all the ice cream truck vendors in the area if they were there and be satisfied with a no answer. Those trucks roam, and I highly doubt that they have tracking devices, especially back in 1999. Maybe now, but I can't picture back then. So it was just like a trust that you were where you said you were at that time type of deal, in my opinion. But given that the music never got louder and nobody can confirm seeing one in the area at all, it's just not normal. The girls heard it. That leads one to believe that maybe someone was luring the kids out, was blending in, and waited until a child was alone and snatched one and was on their way. I've also toyed with the idea of it being more than one person, one driving, one grabbing. Was one on the street and one driving by? It is also completely possible. But then there's the fact that there was no scream. That worries me too. An 11-year-old, smart, alert, and filled with knowledge of stranger danger on a bike, and no one heard anything within the 90 seconds that she was alone. It's baffling how quick this was, and it is terrifying too. Police again said that the way her bike was left in the street facing home and her money a few feet ahead of that, in the direction of home, indicated to them that she was fleeing. If so, why was there no sound? The only car anyone noticed in the neighborhood around this time was the copper-colored Jeep leaving. It's the only one that apparently stood out to people. I don't know what they did to make them so sure that the copper Jeep they tracked down was the same one leaving the neighborhood that day and the same one in the desert, but to me that is far too much of a coincidence to be ruled out so quickly unless there was literally only one copper Jeep in Arizona at the time, which, come on. I know that one of the detectives on the case believes that the case will be solved based on the bike, which they still have in custody as evidence. They have dusted for prints and tested for everything under the sun and hope that further forensic testing developments will solve this case. Me, however, I believe the answers are either with Blaylock if he did it, but if he didn't, the answers are with that copper Jeep and the ice cream truck lead. I think the ice cream truck music was a lure. I don't think it was a real ice cream truck. Just inconspicuous enough to not draw or alert people in the area. A familiar background noise to adults that would not have been concerned about hearing it, and they honestly probably wouldn't have even noticed it that day. But children would. Children would flock to wherever they heard that sound. All they had to do was wait for one of them to be alone, at which point they grabbed and left. Maybe they had scouted the neighborhood prior so they knew their way out, or they had ties to the neighborhood. Maybe not living there presently at the time, considering police had investigated and talked to everybody that currently lived there. But maybe they lived there before, or maybe they had family or friends that currently lived there, or maybe they were in town visiting. Keep in mind, this was a mere day after New Year's. People who know the neighborhood but don't live there could easily be a suspect in this case. They wouldn't be questioned by police, being that they probably had already left. I think that's where answers are for this case. And that's where I would start if this were my case. I'd re-interview neighbors and find out if anyone had family or friends visiting in the area during the time frame that Mikelle went missing. Or maybe even visiting prior to that. They would have had time to scout. Maybe they came back that day, didn't visit their family, but waited. Who knows? There's just so many options here. But again, that's where I would go. If this were my case that I was working, I would re-interview neighbors and find out if anyone had family visiting or friends who left shortly after the disappearance or that can't be accounted for during the window of abduction. But I'm curious, what do you guys think though? What are your theories? What would you have done differently if this was your case? Let me know on the socials or Patreon if you'd like. So sorry about my phone in the background. I'm always curious as to what you guys think. Anyways, that is the vanishing of Mikelle Biggs. I hope that this case is brought to an end soon. I'm not gonna lie, I actually cried while I researched this because I'm a schmuck, but it just pains me when children go missing and are harmed in any way. I lose it. But children deserve to come home, always. Nothing can be changed as to what has happened. All we can do is move forward and bring a baby home and let a family heal. So with that, until next time, guys, stay safe. Fucking invisible ice cream truck on all levels. Mwah. Bye-bye.